Good afternoon from Heirloom Books, 6239 North Clark Street in Chicago, Illinois. I'm Jeff Helgeson. In 1907, the Nobel Prize for Literature was given to, at the age of 41, the youngest person to have ever received that award, as well as its very first English language recipient, in consideration of the power of observation, originality of imagination, virility of ideas, and remarkable talent for narration. The American-British novelist Henry James once said of this writer that he strikes me personally as the most complete man of genius that I've ever known. And the modernist American-British expatriate poet T.S. Eliot said of this writer in a book titled On Poetry and Poets that, in addition to vastly popular fiction, he was a writer of truly great verse. And yet, Rudyard Kipling has also been described, according to an article that appeared in The New Yorker in July of 2019, as a racist and a right-wing imperialist warmonger, or at the very least, as the rabid British colonialist depicted in a 1979 literary calendar sketch. Now, although I suppose there could well be a strong argument made regarding the validity of this characterization, the context within which Kipling should be addressed also, it seems to me, merits some degree of consideration. During the decades after both the First and Second World Wars, within a period of Treaty of Versailles, 14-point Woodrow Wilson declared self-determination, and then large-scale decolonization from European dominance throughout the Middle East, Africa, India, and Asia, the legacy of what once had been Imperial Great Britain underwent a very high degree of reinterpretation. Yet, as Mortimer Adler and Charles Van Doorn point out in How to Read a Book, unless a reader comes to terms with the author, the communication of knowledge from one to the other does not take place. Regarding coming to terms with Kipling, it might be necessary to consider that he primarily wrote at the height of British global influence about an empire upon which the sun was said never to set, a time well before the independence of India in 1947, the creation of the State of Israel in Palestine the following year in 1948, and then the establishment of the People's Republic of China a year after that in 1949, respectively 11, 12, and 13 years following Kipling's death in 1936, 3 years before the beginning of World War II. In terms of the worldview chronicled within Kipling's writing, therefore, was primarily that of an England with a global presence, and within that context, it was largely the members of indigenous populations and the English enlisted soldiers and lower-ranking colonial administrators about whom he had written. In fact, perhaps somewhat prophetically, the poem that Kipling provided in 1897 for Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee, commemorating her 60th year on the English throne, was entitled Recessional, suggesting an end of something far more than its perpetual continuance. In the poem, Kipling observes, "Far called our navies melt away, Our pomp of yesterday is one of Nineveh and Tyre, lost civilizations of the Middle East. Judge of nations, spare us yet, lest we forget, lest we forget. Now, rather than championing the concept of imperialism, seems, to me at any rate, that Kipling was warning of its fragility and essentially what Edward Gibbon had termed with the publication of The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, the inevitable consequence of inordinate greatness. 3 years after providing his recessional verse for Victoria, possibly in light of Great Britain's experience during the 19th century in places like China, northeastern Africa, and Afghanistan, Kipling wrote a poem at the time of the American acquisition of the Philippines, which either was an expression of the rationalized altruistic justification for industrialized nations to exploit the resources of undeveloped regions of the world, or possibly an ironic caution about what George Washington had warned regarding foreign entanglements, although most interpretations of the poem take the piece literally as a blatant imperative to take up the white man's burden, set forth the best ye breed, go bid your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need. The reason Rudyard Kipling wrote about the institution of colonialism could very well have had more to do with its existence than his unwavering advocacy for it. Just as I'd say he can hardly be blamed for 2,000 years of the fishers of men evangelical proselytizing and missionary zeal that had served to distinguish between Christians and just about everybody else throughout the world as being unenlightened heathens. In fact, like with the rank and file British soldier, Kipling seems to have expressed a high regard for individuals from non-Christian societies, famously writing in the Ballad of East and West, "Oh, East is East and West is West, and never the twain shall meet." And then continuing, "But there is neither East nor West, border nor birth, when two strong men stand face to face, though they come from the ends of the earth." Of the Hindu water bearer who nursed English wounded during battle and lost his own life doing it, Kipling wrote, "You're a better man than I am, Gunga Din." And then, in tribute to Muslim fighters from northeast Africa, he toasted, "So here's to you at your home in the Sudan. You're a poor belighted heathen, but a first-class fighting man." Furthermore, with specific regard to missionary zeal, in his early publication of short stories called Plain Tales from the Hills, Kipling observed at the beginning of one of them, "Every man is entitled to his own religious opinions, but no man has the right to thrust these down the throats of other men." Then, too, in response to Alfred Lord Tennyson's The Charge of the Light Brigade, with its rousing "Cannons to the left of them, cannons to the right of them, theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die, into the valley of death rode the 600. Kipling replied some 36 years following the event with his poem, the last of the Light Brigade, ending, 30 million English that babble of England's might. Behold, there are 20 heroes who lack their food tonight. Our children's children are lisping to honor the charge they made, and we leave to the streets and the workhouse the charge of the Light Brigade. The social status and treatment of English enlisted men was a recurrent theme for Kipling. Another time, writing from the perspective of one returned veteran, not unlike those today from the two Gulf Wars who fly the American flags over their homeless tent encampments here in Chicago along DeSable Lakeshore Drive. For it's Tommy this and Tommy that, and chuck him out, the brute. But it's savior of his country when the guns begin to shoot. Rudyard Kipling's most famous poem, If, published in 1910, was presented as advice to his son, who became a commissioned second lieutenant in the Irish Guards during World War I, beginning if you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you, and ending, if all men count for you, but none too much, if you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, yours is the earth and everything in it. And, which is more, you'll be a man, my son. Lieutenant John Kipling went missing in action on September 27th, 1915. And his body was not found until a grave marker for an unknown soldier was changed to bear his name in 1992, almost 6 decades after his bereaved father's death. Kipling had searched for news about his son for several years, as depicted in the stage play My Boy Jack, written by David Haig and later adapted as a motion picture featuring Daniel Radcliffe, who had starred in the Harry Potter films, and Kim Cattrall as Kipling's wife, stepping well away from her persona in the Sex and the City television series. Following the war to end all wars, according to an article that appeared in an Irish publication called the Argus, named for an ancient Greek mythological giant with 100 eyes, Rudyard Kipling worked with Winston Churchill to ensure all soldiers' gravestones were the same shape and size, regardless of military rank. And he also created the phrase, unknown to God. He created the phrase, known only to God, to be inscribed on the headstones of the unknown, like the one that marked his own son's grave for 77 years. Throughout his life, Rudyard Kipling had encountered a mixture of joy and deep sorrow. Born on December 30th, 1865 in Bombay, India, currently called Mumbai, the son of the English manager of an art academy, for the first 6 years of his life, Joseph Rudyard Kipling had been steeped in the rich Indian culture which surrounded him and learned to speak Hindi as fluently as he spoke English. And then, at the age of 6, along with a younger sister, Kipling was sent off to be educated in what turned out to be an extremely abusive boarding school in England. Returning to India 10 years later, he went to work for the Lahore Civil and Military Gazette and quickly became reacquainted with both Indian and British colonial culture, moving easily between exclusive English officer clubs and native opium dens and brothels. His articles quickly led to the publication of light verse, and then that collection of short stories he called Plain Tales from the Hills, which was followed by as many as 6 additional collections of stories before their authors returned to England, marrying the sister of his American publisher when that man suddenly died. Moving with his new bride to the state of Vermont in the U.S., where works like Just So Stories and The Jungle Book were written for his children long before getting the full-scale Walt Disney treatment. However, thanks to a dispute with what seems to have been a chronically intoxicated surviving brother-in-law, Kipling and his wife and 3 children returned to England, but then, on a trip back to the United States, both he and his eldest daughter became extremely ill, the girl, Josephine, passing away while her father, it had been feared, had also been close to death. Recovering his health, the author's attitude toward life appears to have begun to change, something that the death of his son during the Great War further led to what Louis Ottenmeyer in Lives of the Poets describes as being embittered and antisocial. According to Ottenmeyer, Kipling came to disdain the types of people whose interpreters he had been, increasingly identifying with the British upper classes and a kind of manifest destiny for England over its vast colonial empire that was based upon a supposed sense of ethnic and cultural superiority. As distasteful and impossible to dismiss as these attitudes are within today's post-colonial world, their make Britain great again aspect, like the MAGA movement in the United States, could well have emerged for Kipling from a sense of just how much things had changed since his cautionary remarks regarding the decline for Queen Victoria. Within the time following her death in January of 1901, the effects of make-it-new modernism in literature, visual art, and music, as well as those of the First World War, had largely transformed the culture in which Kipling had once thrived as one of the best-known persons on the planet, something that very likely contributed to his highly conservative, reactionary views. The deaths of both his eldest daughter and only son, combined with a sharp decline of his popularity, caused him to become, within his lifetime, as characterized by one editorial, according to Ottenmeyer, the forgotten man of English literature. A year after Kipling's death, the Burmese city of Mandalay that he had written about in the early 1890s, where the sun comes up like thunder over China across the bay, was no longer part of the English Empire. And by the time Frank Sinatra included The Road to Mandalay in his 1958 Come Fly With Me album, the words, "Come you back, you British soldier, come you back to Mandalay," had ceased to have anything but a romanticized, exotic nostalgia in terms of their meaning. What endures for Rudyard Kipling, however, is a legacy, in his own terms, as Mortimer Adler and Charles Van Doren would have it, of both mass popularity and relative literary obscurity, along with books capturing the experience of life within the British Empire, such as Kim, about the adventures of an orphaned Irish child who grows up in the street in India, is led on a spiritual journey by a Tibetan holy man, and becomes involved as a spy in the great game struggle between England and Russia that dominated 19th century world affairs. Along with this, there are such semi-autobiographical works as The Light That Failed and Stories, which became the basis for motion pictures ranging from the 1937 Wee Willie Winkie, starring Shirley Temple, and The Man Who Would Be King, featuring Sean Connery and Michael Caine. Add to this such observations as, there is no sin as great as ignorance. We have 40 million reasons for failure, but not a single excuse. God could not be everywhere, and therefore he invented mothers. The female of the species is more dangerous than the male, as well as never look backwards or you'll fall down the stairs. And it might be possible to say that from within the context of his own terms and times, Rudyard Kipling transcended them. I'm Jeff Helgeson. Heirloom Books is located at 6239 North Clark Street in Chicago, Illinois.